Okay, the date is March 6, 2016. We're here with Peter Merlin. Peter, thanks for taking the time to meet with me. Really appreciate it. Peter, please tell me a little bit about your background and what sparked your interest in aviation.
Well, I'm an aviation and aerospace historian and author. That was something that just sort of happened over a long period of time. I've been interested in aviation and space since I was really, really young. And my dad used to put me in front of the TV whenever there was an Apollo launch or moon landing or something. And so I got interested in space first, and then airplanes next, and just sort of stuck with me. I ended up going to Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University and getting a degree from them in aeronautical studies and management, originally with the idea of getting into the aerospace industry. But at the time I graduated in 1987, the industry was in a real downturn. And so a lot of people were being laid off and companies were downsizing. And so I worked for a commuter airline for about 10 years. And I also became a freelance journalist doing aviation and space stories for various publications, and that kind of began my writing career.
I see. Okay. Peter, please discuss the Lockheed Have Blue program and how it evolved from the Hopeless Diamond to the predecessor for the F-117A stealth fighter.
Well, the Have Blue program was one of the first forays into low observables, or what we call stealth technology, basically making an aircraft to have as small a radar signature as possible and also reduce the infrared and acoustic signatures as well to make the aircraft less detectable to the enemy. This came out of some early studies in the mid-1970s when the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, and the Air Force began looking into the idea of developing a tactical aircraft with sort of all aspect stealth. This had never been done before. There had been a number of approaches to different aircraft where they reduced the radar cross-section by adding radar absorbent material or RAM, changing the shapes of certain parts of an aircraft, but it was all sort of done as an afterthought. This was the first time they were going to design from the beginning an aircraft that would be stealthy. So the original studies were done under Project Harvey, which they looked at several of the major aerospace companies that were involved in developing tactical aircraft, such as McDonnell Douglas and Northrop. And Lockheed was not invited to participate because they had not produced a tactical aircraft in more than 10 years. And as far as anyone knew, they had no experience with low observables. Of course, this is completely false. They had lots of experience with low observables, but it was all top secret. Kelly Johnson, when he developed the A-12, the first Blackbird aircraft, a Mach 3 reconnaissance plane, had been requested by the CIA specifically to reduce the radar cross-section. And so he and his engineers worked very hard to create an airplane that could not only fly high and fast, but also was hard to detect. And it was difficult to make the compromises necessary to achieve those goals. For a long time, Johnson could develop an aircraft that was stealthy, or he could make one that could fly high and fast, but he couldn't do both. And when he reached design number A11, he pretty much gave up and said, we're going to make it fly high and fast and not worry about the other stuff. But the customer, the CIA, said, no, we needed to be as undetectable as we can get. So he went back to the drawing board and came up with the A-12 design. And this spawned a whole series of aircraft, the YF-12, the M-21, which is a mothership for the D-21. The D-21 itself was a drone that could fly at Mach 3 speeds and was designed to be very stealthy. In fact, the D-21 had the lowest radar cross-section of anything that anyone had designed up to that point, and this was in the 1960s. So Lockheed had built up this experience in developing a low observable aircraft, but they just weren't allowed to tell anybody. And so when DARPA and the Air Force were doing Project Harvey, they just ignored Lockheed. But one of the folks at Lockheed, J. Russ Daniel, heard about this Harvey study and said, "We want in." And Kelly Johnson went to the CIA and got permission to declassify some of the information they had, at least to enough of a level that they could share it and prove their experience with developing radar absorbent structures and materials and shaping. So Lockheed was in, but they were late to the game, and so they had to fund the study on their own, which they did, and that gave them a little more control over the proprietary data. And initially, Kelly Johnson said, and he wasn't in charge of the Skunk Works anymore, it was now Ben Rich, but Kelly said, "Look, we've already done the D-21. It's really stealthy. This is what we should start with." So they started looking at a D-21 type shape and making it even stealthier than the original by removing the vertical tail, by sort of changing some of the shaping of the wing structure and the fuselage a little bit. The original Harvey from Lockheed looked almost identical to a D-21, except it didn't have the intake in the front and it didn't have the vertical fin. But otherwise it looked virtually identical. And this was pretty good. It was a good starting point. They made a scale model and tested it at Lockheed's Rye Canyon facility, about 30 miles northwest of Burbank. And then the next generation of Harvey, they kind of smoothed out the curves a little more, which helped. It was a more blended fuselage, made it stealthier. And then they started looking at a different technique called faceting, which involved flat plates. And this was because at the time there were some mathematical calculations developed from a Russian study, ironically, that were then applied to a computer program Dennis Overholzer designed. It's called Echo 1. And he could plot out the exact characteristics of radar cross-section for a series of flat plates joined together in a faceted shape. So you had two kind of competing ideas, the one looking at the D-21 type model and the other looking at a faceted model. And the conventional wisdom of Lockheed at the time was that the D-21 was really good. We should go with this. It was more aerodynamic. Faceting was inherently not aerodynamic. It kind of went against the grain for an aircraft designer to build something that looked like a box, basically. But as it turned out, the calculations with the faceted shape were looking more and more promising. And this kind of proved out in a design. It had about 6 facets total. It was a diamond-shaped thing. It wasn't yet a vehicle, but it was a shape that was sort of the direction they wanted to go. And they called this the hopeless diamond because it seemed hopeless that they could make the thing fly. But it was definitely almost totally invisible to radar. Just fantastic. So as it progressed, they looked at the Harvey a little more, kind of figured out what about a 6,000-pound aircraft would look like. Changed the shape of the wings. It was almost a delta, sort of teardrop-shaped design. And the other concept, based on the hopeless diamond, they added wings to that. So you had very swept wings coming off the diamond, and keeping everything, all the edges had to be lined up so that they would not produce a radar reflection. The idea was to have the radar waves not return to the receiver. So you wanted everything to go off away and sort of be deflected. And ultimately, that was what they went with for the XST, the Experimental Survivable Test Bed. And now you're looking at turning the concept into a real piece of hardware, an actual aircraft that could fly. This was, again, a real challenge because you had a strange shape that was not particularly aerodynamic. They knew it would be unstable in all aspects of flight, so it was going to need kind of a fly-by-wire type system. Though not the digital one yet, they were still doing an analog system at this point. So you had the Diamond with its highly swept wings, and it was necessary to add a couple of vertical fins, which were canted inward to make them less likely to reflect radar. And this evolved into two demonstrators under the name Have Blue. Now, Northrop was also still in the game, and they produced their own XST type design, which was it was a little different. It was somewhat faceted. It had a very angular sweep. There was a big intake up on the top of the fuselage, right behind the cockpit, which might have been a problem if the pilot had to eject. It had twin inwardly canted tail fins. And it was a pretty good design, but it didn't quite have the low radar cross-section numbers that Lockheed's XST had. So Lockheed won the competition. And the government told Northrop, hey, we want you to stay in the game. We're going to have some other projects coming down the line, and we want Northrop's expertise. So they eventually got to continue on and develop the stealth bomber. But in the meantime, Lockheed took their XST and turned it into Have Blue. There were two prototypes. They were very small aircraft, just capable enough to do the job they had to do. They were strictly technology demonstrators and not intended to be anything close to an operational system. And the first airframe was built primarily to test the handling qualities, and the pilot would take that up and fly around and just make sure that it could stay in the air and keep the front end forward. It had unusual wings in that they did not have the typical rounded edge airfoil shape. It was very angular to continue the whole faceting. It was very much designed by electrical engineers rather than aeronautical engineers. And that was a whole revolution in how to design an airplane. Because the primary goal was stealth, and the flying qualities were somewhat secondary.
Wow, Peter, you are so authoritative. You really are. I mean, you are the voice of reason, Peter. You really are. That's incredible. Peter, please discuss the original members of the Blue Team at the Pentagon's Low Observable Office and what other black programs that they may have been involved in other than the F-117. So this would be Jerry Babber, Dave England, Joe Ralston, and Robert Bond.
Right. Yeah, there was a small team at the Pentagon that was assigned to study low observable aircraft technology in the 1970s and early 1980s. And initially they were starting with the XST and Have Blue. But all of this was put under the blanket of the senior high program, which is just to cover all stealth aircraft and development projects at that time. So they also looked at the idea of a stealthy cruise missile, because at the time, that was considered to be one of the best systems if you wanted to have a penetrating capability for a weapon that could get through heavily defended airspace. It's one thing to send in a stealthy aircraft with a pilot, but it's a lot safer to just make a cruise missile and send it in remotely piloted or autonomous. So they looked at that possibility, and shortly after Have Blue began, and they could see that that was looking to be a really successful program, the team at the Pentagon decided, we want to scale this up and make a stealth fighter. Well, stealth fighter is a little bit of a misnomer because it was never intended to be an air combat aircraft. It was supposed to be essentially a small tactical bomber that could carry a couple of weapons in through heavily defended airspace and strike a target before being detected. Sort of a silver bullet approach. At that time, the prevailing tactics involved sending a large air armada into enemy airspace with the idea that there would be a lot of attrition and you would lose a substantial amount of your fleet, but hopefully one or two aircraft would make it in to strike the target. By using a stealth aircraft, you didn't have that problem. You were eliminating the attrition by eliminating the detectability of the aircraft. You just slip it right in through the radars and hit the target and hopefully get out again, which of course we proved in Operation Desert Storm with the F-117A, which was the heir to Have Blue. F-117A was developed under the Senior Trend program, and like Have Blue, it was tested in Nevada at Area 51. The airplanes were originally operationally deployed to Tonopah Test Range and then later to Holloman Air Force Base after Desert Storm when the program was more in the white world. The Pentagon team that worked on the stealth projects also sought to develop a stealthy battlefield surveillance aircraft, which became the Tacit Blue. Tacit Blue ended up serving essentially as a demonstrator, and the battlefield surveillance aircraft was not produced in numbers as they had hoped. But Tacit Blue also became the demonstrator for technologies subsequently applied in the B-2 stealth bomber.
Okay, great. Peter, are there any officially declassified Lockheed photographs available of Have Blue's takeoff roll during its first flight at Area 51 on December 1st, 1977?
I don't think that there have been any pictures released of the original takeoff of Have Blue. I've never seen any. The first Have Blue aircraft, it was not meant to be completely stealthy, so it had some extra things on it. There's a box on the back of the aircraft for a drag chute if they needed to slow down on the runway during landing. There was a long test boom on the nose, and again, that's obviously not a stealthy feature. And the airplane was painted in a camouflage scheme to confuse any unauthorized observers, to prevent them from seeing what the shape of the aircraft was. I've never seen pictures of that configuration in flight. I've seen pictures of it on the ground. There were 2 photos that were released, and all the other pictures that came later either showed the number 2 aircraft, which did not have the nose boom or the chute box on the back, and it was just a light gray paint scheme. Of course, Ship 1 was converted to that low observable scheme shortly before it was lost in 1978 in an accident, so some of those pictures might be Ship 1 just after it was repainted, just from later flights. Both Have Blue aircraft were lost in accidents. They had served their purpose, essentially, so there wasn't really any loss of data. Both pilots survived, thank goodness. One of the airplanes crashed when it was being flown by Bill Park, the Lockheed test pilot. The other was Ken Dyson, who was the Air Force test pilot, and he had taken over flying the program primarily after Bill Park's accident, because Bill, although he survived, he never flew again.
Okay. Peter, did you ever get a chance to meet Ben Rich, and did he ever provide any additional hints on what other spooky aircraft may have been built inside the walls of the Skunk Works in Burbank?
I was fortunate to meet Ben Rich once. In fact, a lot of these guys, Bill Park, Ken Dyson, a lot of the early pioneers of stealth. Ben was an interesting guy. He was very smart, and he had a very different management style than his predecessor, Kelly Johnson. He was a little bit more laid back. He was very proud of the projects that he worked on at the Skunk Works, particularly spearheading Have Blue and the F-117, as well as applications of that to a naval surface vessel called the Sea Shadow, stealth cruise missile, and they'd also had some proposals for an advanced technology stealth bomber, which went up in competition against Northrop. Well, Northrop won the contract for that, but Lockheed at least did some radar cross-section model work, and to the best of my knowledge, I don't think they ever actually flew a prototype, but that was only because they were early on told not to particularly compete with Northrop, because I think the Air Force wanted to have a wider portfolio of industry experts in low observables, not just a monopoly on the Lockheed side. They wanted to share the wealth with Northrop, and that proved to be a very wise choice, because now Northrop has developed a B-2 and they've picked up a contract for a new bomber called the B-21.
Wow, okay. Peter.
Let me just, I'll just add, I just want to add a few other Ben Rich things.
Okay, yeah.
Ben Rich had a real sense of humor, and it may have gotten him in some trouble because he used to give presentations on the history of the Skunk Works and the Skunk Works accomplishments. And he went from a script, which I can relate to because when I give talks, if I have a lot of information that I want to get forth to the audience, I frequently use a script. Well, around 1983, he started ending his talks by saying, there's a lot going on with the Skunk Works, but I can't tell you anything about it. We usually reveal something about every 10 years, so you'll have to invite me back to give another talk. But I can tell you this, the Lockheed Skunk Works just got a contract to send E.T. back home. He was just taking advantage of the popularity of the movie E.T. the Extraterrestrial, about the little alien who wanted to go home. And so it was just a gag, but unfortunately some people took him a little more seriously than that was meant to be. And Ben also, as much as he liked to talk about things, and he published a book, his autobiography, Skunk Works, which he wrote with Leo Janos. That book got a lot of response from the people who had been the pioneers of stealth, who worked hand in glove with Ben Rich and with the Air Force Office of the Pentagon that was responsible for low observables, and all these guys like Baber and all the early people. They took issue with much of what Ben wrote in his book, and even people who really like and respect Ben Rich as a friend and as a man were quick to say that he tended to exaggerate. So you sort of have to take Ben's writing with a grain of salt, because not everything in there is exactly the way it happened. So it's probably good to get the perspectives of a lot of the other people who were involved.
Wow, okay. Peter, what advanced aircraft do you think were designed, built, and flown under the temporary organization known as the Advanced Aeronautics Company